Welcome everybody to the first of possibly two tutorials in the basics of exposure. So what I'm planning to do on this tutorial is give you a very basic overview of how light gets into a camera and what you can do to control that light and how that affects the pictures that you're going to take. And then in part two, what I'm going to do is I'm going to flash up some actual pictures showing you different settings and how they've affected the image we've taken. So, you'll often see photography referred to as painting with light. And light management is really central to taking a photograph. I know it sounds like an obvious thing to say, but you really do have to concentrate and pay attention to how the light's getting into your camera. Put too much light in or too little light, then that will affect the image that you take. And sometimes it's used as deliberate effect, but normally it's an accident and it results in a picture that isn't as good as you want it to be. You've got overexposure, which is where you put too much light into the image, and there's underexposure where there's not enough light. Sometimes it's a case of there is simply too much or too little light around, but again, through control of the camera settings, you can really control that. Overall, there are three settings that we're concentrating on, and this is known as the exposure triangle. You've got the aperture, which is an area that allows light through the lens. You've got the shutter speed, which is the time that the light is allowed to strike the sensor. And then you've got the sensor speed, so how quickly your sensor reacts to the light that's coming into it. And this is the same for pretty much any camera or any optical device that you can think of. It might be the little webcam on your tablet that costs £1 when they're manufactured, through to a 20 grand phase 1 professional camera that's got 60 megapixel sensor in it. They all follow the same basic principles. Each one of these settings controls the light in a different way, and they also have a creative impact as well. So let's have a look at the exposure triangle. And here you can see there are three terms: ISO or ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Now don't be daunted too much by this diagram. I know there's a lot on it, but really what we're going to do is we're going to break this down and we're going to show you that actually changing the settings one by one is relatively simple and straightforward. You can see from this picture that the aperture controls the area of light that can enter the camera, shutter speed controls the time that light is allowed in, and ISO controls the sensitivity. So let's look at them in turn. First off, we'll look at the aperture. So again, just to reiterate, the aperture is the opening in the lens that lets out the light. So really, it's the start of the process. The aperture of a camera, or its lens, is denoted by a number or a stop. It's usually called an f-stop, and it has the symbol F. Now the aperture goes up and down roughly in factors of 2, as does shutter speed and ISO, so that makes interchanging them simple, because if you increase the aperture, you decrease the shutter speed, for example, and because they both go in doubles, then as you increase one, then you decrease the other by the same amount. On a modern camera, for example a digital SLR, you'll also have EVs or exposure values, and these tend to be 1/3 of a full stop. So on the old mechanical SLRs, you had a dial, quite a clunky dial on some of them, and you would go through full stops. But with the digital now, I guess the sky's the limit with electrical actuation, and you can actually stop at 1/3 of an EV at a time. As well as actually controlling the light, so a wide open aperture lets in a lot of light and a small aperture lets in a little, the creative side of this, its main effect, is what's called depth of field. And I posted a couple of pictures last weekend showing this. So depth of field is the amount of area in front of and behind the point that you focused on that's also in focus. So you can have very little depth of field where only your object is in focus, but you can have a lot of depth of field where the majority of the field of view is also in focus. And we'll look at worked examples of that in part 2. So here's an old picture of f-stops on the aperture range. And the first thing that you might notice is that while I said that it goes up and down in factors of 2, those numbers don't. And the reason is that we're working with the area of a circle. So even though they go up and down, doubling and halving, the actual numbers themselves don't refer to the area, they refer to something else. So it's quite complicated, so let's not bother with it. Just bear in mind that each one of those numbers, 2.84, 5.6 and so on, is a full stop. So again, on modern cameras you might be able to go up in thirds. And you can see here that it's telling you that for a large aperture, which confusingly has a small number, you have shallow depth of field. You move in to a very small aperture and that gives you the largest depth of field. And in actuality, on a modern lens, you might be able to stop open down to 1.4 and you might be able to stop closed up to f26 or even 32. So it's a really quite a wide range when you take a third of the stops in between. So let's have a look at the shutter speed. As has already been explained, this is the actual amount of time that your sensor at the back of your camera, or your film if you're shooting old school, is exposed to the light coming through the aperture. This actually does move up and down roughly in halves. The reason I say roughly is because when you go down from, for example, 1/125th of a second, it doesn't go to a 62.5 of a second. It goes to 1/60. So, but roughly speaking, you double and halve as you go up and down the scale. You can have a very fast shutter speed or a very slow one, and the reasons for that we'll come to. But you can go up to 1/4000th of a second, which is easier said than done. And you can also just hold the shutter open. Some cameras will let you do that. It's called bulb time, and it has the symbol B on the dial. And you simply let light in for as long as you want. You have a stopwatch and possibly a remote control or a cable release on an old camera, and you would time it and then let it go. Anything slower than 1/30th of a second, as a rule of thumb, needs a tripod to hold the camera steady, because as your arms shake, as your body shakes, so that shake gets transferred to the picture you're trying to take. So here again, just a very rough picture showing you what you can do. It's mentioning bulb time there as well, which is handy. You would use a slow shutter speed typically when you don't have much light to work with. You can use it creatively down for waterfalls or other water to smooth out the waves, and it gives it a very smooth and ripple-free effect, which is very nice. And also another common reason why you'd use a slow shutter speed is for light trails at night. So taking a picture of traffic or a starscape, and you can actually capture the motion. A very fast shutter speed, well, things like motorsport, capturing a moment, street photography, or even perhaps wedding photography, and wildlife as well. Anything where you need to freeze frame a moment. So lastly, let's look at the third corner of our exposure triangle, the ISO. Now ISO used to be called ASA and EN, and it actually stands for the International Standards Organization. And back with ASA and EN, it was American and English. And it relates to the standard that film was made to. You would use a fast film or a slow film, and this denotes how quickly it reacts to available light. And of course, once you loaded a film in the camera, you either had to take a few pictures and then throw the rest away, or you had to use up the rest of the roll of the film. Now with modern cameras, you can just simply, at a touch of a button, change which ISO you want appropriate to what you're trying to do. So we've got a lot more flexibility now than we used to. The old professionals just used to carry 2 or 3 cameras around. Again, we move up and down in factors of 2. Typically you'd start at around about 100. Perhaps with a real specialist camera you might go down to 50, and you can go up really quite high. Modern cameras are up over 12,000 on the ISO. Now, obviously, because you're doubling up and down, it doesn't take much effort to get to 12,000. And from here, it's 2 steps. You go 6,400 and then 12,800, and there you go. But those extra stops, believe me, they're really required. Now, as well as just letting in more light, there is also a creative effect to ISO. Sometimes it's not wanted, and sometimes it is. At a low ISO value, your image is more detailed and tends to be considered softer. That's a sort of a bit of a term you have to see to understand. But like I say, in part 2, we'll do some worked examples and show you what I mean. A high ISO value, you tend to lose a bit of detail and sometimes get an image that's referred to as grainy or hard. And you might actually want this. Typically, National Geographic back in the day used to take photos at very low ISO, things like tropical birds and jungles and such. And this would give you quite a rich and soft image. And if you wanted a gritty sort of street view in black and white, you would go high ISO and you'd have a grainy shot. And again, you can still do that these days with a modern camera that lets you change it. So, of course, we've got 3 sides of a triangle, 3 ways to control the light going into the camera, so it could be quite confusing. However, they do work together and they do the same basic thing. So provided you've got a creative effect that you want to achieve and you know this in advance, it's reasonably straightforward to do this. And after a bit of practice, it becomes second nature. What we'll do in part 2, as well as showing you worked examples, is go through a few techniques to get you started on how to change the settings with confidence. There are a number of camera modes that are intermediate. You don't have to go straight into controlling everything at once. You can change things one at a time and let the camera change the other 2 for you. So we'll talk about that. You don't have to be a genius, you don't have to be any kind of nuclear physicist or Brian Cox or anything like that to get the hang of this. Once you've been given a few basic pointers, it will become second nature in no time. So anyway, thanks for listening to this, and if you've got any questions, please post them to the group or put them in the comments below this video.